Good morning. A budget that hasn't unravelled, a return of sorts for Boris Johnson, and a reality star who finally has justice. Quite the mix in the next 60 minutes.
Hello, what's your name?
Gather round. The Chancellor wants you to think he's got the future covered. He's after top marks for more childcare and encouraging people back to work.
The only place success comes before work is the dictionary.
The Prime Minister boasting of other good news.
I hope you've heard the good news, I hope.
A possible pay deal with some NHS staff who've been out on strike.
No pay, no stay!
But hang on. Junior doctors are still in the fight and other workers were out on the streets too.
Call a Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Just as Mr Hunt was on his feet, where his opponents claim the changes to pensions he's bringing in are a bung for the mega-rich.
Why are we bringing the pensions relief in for the wealthiest in society next month, but those who are really struggling with the cost of living now have to wait until next April?
And living standards for everyone are still on the slide. Yet there's a chipper mood among ministers these days. So we have one big question this morning. Are there signs that the Tories are getting back on track? The man who needs to make sure the government gets things done, Cabinet Minister Oliver Dowden, is with us. Labour's Lisa Nandy will be here too. She's criticised the budget, but how would Labour raise our living standards? It's been a terrible week for the SNP. We'll hear from one of the contenders to replace Nicola Sturgeon in the top job, Kate Forbes. And Georgia Harrison, the presenter, now campaigner, is here. Her bravery put her ex-partner behind bars after he posted explicit images of her online. We'll hear how she wants to stop other women going through that same kind of nightmare. And to help me out here at the desk this morning, the founder of Mumsnet, Justine Roberts, Ollie Dugmore, the editor of the social media news site Politics Joe, and the tech entrepreneur Brent Hoberman. Morning. It's great to be with you. So the government has made it to the Sunday after the budget without a meltdown. Has it even made the front pages this morning? Let's take a look. Well, it hasn't made these three. The Mail, the Express and the Sunday Telegraph all splash on the Home Secretary's visit to Rwanda and her plans for migrants. Then look at some other newspapers, different stories on there too. The Scottish Sunday Mail talking about sex, lies and spin, it says in the SNP after their terrible few days. The Observer says that Boris Johnson is trying to make a last-ditch bid to discredit the probe into Partygate. We'll talk about that a bit later on. And the Sunday Mirror says that Britain should be proud of Gary Lineker, of course, what we were talking about here last week. So let's talk to our panel, and welcome to you all. Justine, the sort of centrepiece, the big promise for our voters in the budget was childcare. But is what the government have put forward credible? It's not going to come in for quite a long time.
No, it's not. But I mean, first off, let's just celebrate the fact that finally a political party has put a major investment into childcare, and something that Mumsnet, we've been banging on about this for about 20 years. So let's at least celebrate that big tick. They've recognised that childcare has to start from 9 months, not from 3 years, which is a big tip for women who are often sort of tempted to leave the workplace, can't get back in. But there is a serious question about funding. The sector is already underfunded. They tend to providers subsidise. They get lower funding for 3 to 4 year olds than they should from the government. They subsidise it by charging more for 1s and 2s. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. Childminders are leaving the profession in droves. There's a shortage of workers. So this is going to be the real challenge.
So logistically difficult to do, but you like the idea of the promise. That was for one demographic for parents around the country. Ollie, what about your demographic? I mean, you provide news on social media, primarily targeted at young men. What was the response to the budget among your audience?
I would say that it was obvious by what wasn't included. Housing, huge problem for my generation. The prospect of you face an economic and political choice when you're growing up. Either you can stay in the town you grew up in and not necessarily get the job that you wanted to or pursue the profession that you want, or you move to an urban centre, Manchester, Birmingham, London, to pursue a career. However, your prospect of owning a home is very, very low in those kind of places.
And what's the political consequence for the Conservatives of that, do you think?
Well, potentially not that much. I mean, we live in a country with ageing demographics, so you see things like lifting the £1 million cap on the lifetime allowance for pensioners. There's pension reform, pension policy is a huge area of political gain. People don't really care about the younger generation because you can't win an election just by catering to them. OK, surely you're not a sceptic or a cynic here in the studio talking about politics. And Brent, you've run big businesses. People will know you from setting up lastminute.com. Now you're really involved in lots of different technology businesses. Aside from the budget, in that world, there was something that seemed very concerning this week, the collapse of SVB Bank, a bank in America and here in the UK that provides funding to startups. Should we be worried about what's going on in that sector?
The SVB was critically important to the tech sector. They actually happen to be small investors of ours as well, so we know them well. They were banking 1 in 2 of the best startups in this country, so they were systemically important to the tech sector, not to the entire system, as the Prime Minister said. But there was a sense of absolute panic. When you can't get your deposits out of a bank, people do fear, or there was a worry that that might not happen. I felt always that was not going to happen, that they were going to get their deposits out. They did get their deposits out. The bank is now very safe, backed by HSBC. It's a really good solution. There is a lot of calmness now after that weekend. And I think we can go back to optimism. HSBC, with its $3 trillion balance sheet, has said it will pump more money into this. This could actually be a really good silver lining for the tech community. OK, perhaps a near miss that we should all be not that concerned about. Thank you all three of you for now, but hard work ahead for you, so stay with us. The budget has not fallen apart, and the Prime Minister very much wants to be seen as ticking his promises off the list. And there is a sense in the Conservative Party, at least, that maybe they are getting back on track. And they've even made a sort of peace with some of the unions.
There's hope moving forward that we are in a different place with government, and we will no longer find ourselves in a position that we have to take to picket lines to have a government to hear our voice.
Some strikes are still in the offing, and you might wonder what took the government so long to sort them out. Oliver Dowden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Rishi Sunak's right-hand man, is with us here, and there's lots to get through with you this morning. And the government's made big decisions this week about the budget and about the unions, and we'll look at both. When it comes to the strikes, why did you and your colleagues spend months on this programme, saying it was impossible to find more money, saying it was impossible to talk about this year's pay, and saying it was impossible to ignore the pay review body? And then, lo and behold, months later, after disruption for the public, there's suddenly a solution.
Well, look, first of all, I think we've got a reasonable deal, one that's fair to nurses, but fair, crucially to your point, fair to the public finances, and fair to making sure that we stick to our goal of halving inflation. We couldn't have been in a situation where we chased inflation through ever higher wage rises. And if you look at the initial position of the RCM, which I think was about 19%, clearly that would have been chasing inflation. We've got to a more sensible position. I think it's one that works for both of us, and I very much hope that it's not just the nurses, but also ambulance workers and others on the so-called agenda for change will support this package. But
the question here that I think a lot of our viewers will have this morning is, why did what you said was impossible for months suddenly possible? And the Department of Health even recently said 3.5% might be doable, but 5% certainly was not affordable. And that is what has happened. Why waste so much time and leave the public with such disruption?
Well, first of all, the 3.5%, which was announced a few weeks ago, that was the affordability number. So that was the base position of the government for the coming financial year. I think it has been the case that there has been movement. So I very much welcome the fact that the RCN moved from their position of 19%, which would not have been affordable and would have fueled inflation. And the government was willing to move its position as well, because we need to reward nurses properly, but we need to do so in a way that is sustainable for our public finances and inflation. I think this balance is correct.
But the question here, Oliver Dowden, is that you said for many months, you and other colleagues sitting in that chair, you said it was not possible. You said more money was not possible. You said you could not talk about next year's pay review. And now that has happened after months of disruption for the public. A viewer of the BBC, David from Yorkshire, has told his story. I think we can show our viewers a picture of him. He had chest pains on a strike day. He was told it would be an hour and a half for an ambulance. That's somebody who had existing heart problems. When someone did arrive, he was told that the driver was a cadet. They couldn't put blue lights on to rush him to hospital. Can you say to him and our viewers this morning that these months where you were refusing to talk was worth it?
Well, first of all, we were always willing to engage with the
not
unions.
Not on this year's pay, you were not.
And we had initial discussions with them. If we want to get into the sort of intersteins, as it were, of the two different deals, I think my overall dispensation is we've got a decent deal now. Let's move forward. But in terms of the actual specifics of it, first of all, the RCN moved their position. Secondly, the additional amounts that we've agreed for this year are so-called non-consolidated. So that means that they don't really add enormously to inflation because they don't carry forward, and they don't add so much to the pressure on public finances. Then in addition to that, we've looked forward to the coming year, which we always said we were willing to do so. And the number we've got for the coming year is broadly aligned with where we expect wider private sector pay to go. So it's a decent deal, and I would urge people to support it. And it helps us to keep two of our key objectives. First of all, cutting the waiting list and halving inflation.
And you say there it is a decent deal. Should that therefore be the kind of deal that the public should see offered to teachers, civil servants, professions where there may still be strikes or there's still talks ongoing? Should we expect that?
Well, as you've highlighted, we've got talks ongoing with the teachers. I hope we can get to a decent position. It is just worth noting that in respect of the deal that has been reached for the nurses, there's 4% of that which is an additional payment for the current year to reflect the huge pressure they've been under and the need to cut the waiting list, which is one of our key targets.
OK, so there are still decisions to be taken, but it sounds like you hope that might happen. It's also been the budget this week, so another moment of big decisions. After saying for months there wasn't going to be much money for much because of what's happened to the finances of the country, you did find a few £1 billion to give some of the richest people in the country money towards their pensions. Now, why are you doing that when we are also, as a country, people watching this programme, facing the biggest fall in living standards for decades and decades and decades?
Well, we had a very specific problem, and we still have it, which is when people in senior roles in the public sector, particularly people like consultants, but it's also senior police officers and others, they get caught in this trap whereby if they carry on working and earning more, they breach their pensions cap. Now, we're under a lot of pressure and lobbying to do something about this from the Labour Party, from the BMA and others. We've taken this action, and the consequence of it is we'll have more senior public sector workers working in the public sector, helping deliver on our core priorities, whether that's cutting the waiting list, because we'll have more consultants, whether that's getting crime under control. And I was very heartened by the fact, for example, that the BMA welcomed this and said it was transformative. So it's the right policy to address this particular problem.
But if you say it's the right policy, it's also a pretty nice idea for a lot of people who already have a lot of money. There are 45,000 consultants in the NHS. There are 1 million people who have around about £1 million in their pension pot. This is a policy that is going to give some of the wealthiest people in the country more money when many people are struggling to put food on the table. How can you justify that?
Well, it's not just consultants, and by the way, this is a huge problem, making sure that we get decent consultants.
I'm not saying it's not, but this is for 1 million people, some of the wealthiest people in the country.
It's also senior leadership in schools, it's also senior leadership in our police forces, and also I think it's a basic decent principle that if people work hard, they should be able to save money and invest for their retirement. So I think there's a basic principle there. But the reason why we brought this forward now is because of the particular pressure for senior public service workers who we need to make sure that we deliver some of the government's core priorities.
How many of those million people who've got £1 million or more in their pension are public sector workers?
Well, I couldn't give you the exact breakdown now, but it's a very large number because if you remember, for most of the public services, they get around 20% on top of their salaries in their pensions. So that does mean that it tends to be a lot of public sector workers who are hit by this cap.
Well, it'll be interesting if we can find that figure out for our viewers. Another decision that the government made this week was to ban TikTok, the social media app on government phones. Now, I'm not sure that your colleague, Grant Shapps in the Cabinet, was very impressed about this. I think we can show our viewers his response to the ban on TikTok. He got busy on his own personal phone and posted all his videos there and posted a joking video of Leonardo DiCaprio saying, "I'm not leaving." Now, TikTok, the company, They reckon that the government's only doing this because you've got a political beef with China. Do you have any evidence that TikTok really is a risk?
Yeah, there is a very specific risk. I would say two things, first of all. One is that a lot of these apps, and particularly social media apps, hoover up a vast amount of data. And I think many of your viewers may not quite know how much data is being hoovered up, whether that's geolocation, contacts, all these things you have on your phone. In addition, and remember this announcement is in respect of government phones, the sensitive government information on government phones. There's a higher risk on government phones. In respect of TikTok, there is then a further risk, which is the ultimate ownership of TikTok vests in China, and all Chinese companies are subject to China's national security laws, which means that that information can be made available to the government in that country. So on the balance of risks, we believe that first of all, in respect of TikTok, we need to introduce a ban immediately. And in respect of the other risks that I've outlined, we're going to have a permissionary system whereby we only have apps on government phones that are approved.
But viewers watching this morning might wonder, should they be on TikTok? I mean, if there is a genuine risk, lots of people have sensitive information on their phones. Is TikTok dangerous? Should our viewers take it off their phones?
No, I think the balance that we've struck is the right one, given the sensitive nature of government information. What I would say to all of your viewers is I would just be cautious in respect of all social media apps, just to be aware of the amount of data that's being harvested. Now, we live in a free country and people should be able to make their own choices, but they should make an informed choice about the amount of data that is available there.
That's interesting. Do you think that we are potentially moving towards some kind of ban for everybody on TikTok?
No, I don't think we're moving in that direction. I set out the reasons. It is both to do with the ownership and sensitive government information, which has pushed us across the line. I have to say it's on a precautionary basis, but I would just say that generally, in respect to the amount of information that is available, people need to take appropriate precautions across the board.
Okay, now people are also going to see something new pop up on their phones shortly, and I should warn people that they're about to hear something loud, I think. There we are, the government's emergency alert that is going to be coming to all our phones in a couple of weeks' time. What is the point of this? You're going to be running a national trial, we're all going to see it pop up. What's the reason?
Well, this is a sound that can save your life, and this is what we've seen in many other countries, so for example the United States, Netherlands, elsewhere. And the reason why you do this is that if there is a risk to your life, a really very serious situation, this is another tool in the toolkit of the government getting that information across to you. Now, everyone will hear it it's actually a month's time. There'll be a 10-second test just to make sure it can roll out to everyone. We've carried out regional tests. This will be a national one. After that, I would very much hope most people will never hear this again, or they might not hear it for a month or two. The sort of situation that they would find themselves hearing from it is, for example, if you had a major flood where your house was at risk of being inundated and your life was at risk, that alert would be sent. It's sent in a very targeted way, so it would only be in appropriate wards. It's at that level to get that information across to you, and it sits alongside other government communications.
So people shouldn't fret, it's part of a plan and it's there only in dire emergencies should we need it in future. I just want to ask you about a couple of other issues. You talked there about people never wanting to hear that alert. I think some of your colleagues might never want to hear again from Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, but he will be popping up this week. He'll be facing questions from MPs about exactly what happened under his roof during lockdown. Now, he's already had a police fine, but his allies have been very busy claiming that somehow the processes he's going through is unfair. Do you think that's a valid concern, or is this actually a bit of a shameless attempt to try to make him look like some kind of victim?
Well, this is really a matter for the House of Commons for Parliament, and it's the usual precedent that ministers don't comment on these things.
Yeah, but you know it well. Has he got a valid concern there, or actually is it just some kind of shameless attempt to get off?
Well, Laura, what I would say is I've known Boris Johnson reasonably well over the years. I'm quite sure that he will put forward a robust defence of his conduct. It will then be for the committee to make that determination, and if necessary, the House of Commons to make that determination. I think that's the proper process to go through.
Well, we'll see what happens here. And lastly, I must ask you, you were the Culture Secretary when the government, you and Boris Johnson, appointed Richard Sharp as the chair of the BBC. Now, there are more claims this morning about him not following rules and process in a way that he ought to. And many people and the opposition parties claim that that damages the reputation for the BBC. Do you have confidence in him, or is it time for the men in grey suits to say, thank you very much for your service, but time to step aside?
I oversaw the process of the appointment of Richard Sharp. First of all, I should say that that was a proper process, and I have every confidence in that. I know it's been looked into, but I'm confident we chose.
Confidence in him
well,
now?
I was going to say, Laura, I'm confident that we chose the right person to do the job of chairman of the BBC, and I continue to have confidence in him, yes.
OK, Oliver Dowden, thank you very much indeed for coming in and taking questions on such a wide range of subjects. It's always good to have you here in the studio. Now, we're going to talk about something a bit different. You probably recognise Georgia Harrison. She was a Love Island star whose life was turned upside down when her ex, Stephen Bear, posted explicit footage of her online without her consent. He is now in jail, and she has waived her anonymity to tell the story in a documentary for ITV tomorrow.
I'm making this statement to tell the court the impact this horrific crime has had on me. When Stephen Bear filmed me without telling me, it not only stole that choice from me, but it also seriously affected the way I trust people, especially in intimate situations. When I first saw the screenshot of the footage and realised it had been sold online by him, I felt physically sick.
Georgia, you've turned something terrible into something really meaningful, but why did you make the decision to go to court? It's such a difficult decision for a lot of people.
I just felt it was the only option. I'd been pushed so far, and before I actually saw that the video had gone viral on the internet, I'd had multiple men telling me that they'd had it shown to them. So I think when I saw it was on OnlyFans, it was just the final straw for me. And yeah, I didn't think so much. I just took the action.
So it was your instinct?
It was my instinct.
But that must have been terrible when that happened. I mean, and people were saying to you, I've seen you here in that kind of way online.
Yeah, it was awful. And, you know, the footage itself that did go online was about 6 minutes long, but the actual video that he taped was 20 minutes. So I was also very aware that other people were viewing the whole thing, which was a lot harder for me to cope with. And I was living in fear that he was going to sell more. So I was hoping the police could put a stop to it. And luckily, the rest of the footage never did emerge.
So you say it was your instinct to take it on, to go and pursue justice. But you've also said that the experience of doing that, then going to court, giving your evidence, having all the public scrutiny, you've said also that changed you. How has it made you a different person?
I just think, in a way, it just took away an innocent sort of spark that I always had. I was a very trusting individual, and I was always someone that just saw the best in everything. And when that happened to me, it just really lowered my self-worth, and it really lowered the way that I value myself, especially in relationships.
What about the process of then going to court? And now you have justice and he is behind bars.
It was tough, and it was really scary. I think it was scarier than I thought it would be, but when I actually got in the courtroom, it was almost empowering. I'd been silenced for so long, and not only did I have my opportunity to speak to a judge and really tell the truth, I got to do that with him in the room and also his family in the room, and it was nice to validate the truth.
So you took that power back that had been taken from you?
I took that power back, and you will see all of that in the documentary tomorrow at 10 p.m.
A lot of our viewers, I think especially parents, might think, hearing your story this morning or watching the documentary tomorrow night, might just think, hang on, you know, what is going on here? We have a situation where a young man has filmed a young woman, has shared images, explicit images online, that has then sort of taken over your life in a way. And I know that since you've spoken out, many women have been in contact with you. What kinds of things have you been told?
Well, this is the thing. My case in general has like really shocked the British public, but it is such a common thing, but it's not so common. Like, ever since this happened to me, I became someone that victims reach out to, and I get at least 5 women messaging me a day, usually victims, but sometimes mothers of victims or family members who want advice. And obviously it's a really embarrassing thing to happen to you, and for most people they can contain the amount of people that see the images or videos, so they do their best not to voice their opinion and sort of go public about it, and I really respect that, but you just wouldn't believe how big this is and how many people are being affected by it.
And why do you think we've got to that situation? Because where there is a whole generation of young people having to put up with this kind of thing. You know, there is a big conversation in the country at the moment going on about how women are treated online, or then, you know, people will be familiar with the name of the influencer Andrew Tate, who shares or has shared very derogatory content. Like, how have we got to this situation, do you think?
I think society has been like this for a very long time. If you look at the Pamela Anderson documentary, the way the media and the public ridiculed her for what happened to her, which was very similar to me, it was just seen as a joke and like it wasn't a big deal, and that this sort of a thing is, I guess, cool and funny in a misogynist world, but it isn't. And finally, with my case, I feel like the public have really taken it seriously, and they've made it very obvious that what happened to me was very shameful on his part. And I think the younger generation are going to look at this and think, I don't want to end up like Stephen Bear, I don't want to be publicly shamed, I don't want to go to prison, and if I do act in this way, it is morally wrong.
So do you think then this is a moment where the culture you described that's emerged, where women are victimised online in that way, might be beginning to change? Is that what you hope?
I definitely think it's beginning to change. I think so many people are standing up against this sort of behaviour, and it does come across on social media. If you get the odd person who writes a comment in support of Bear, there's so many more people that come back to say just how wrong it is, and I think it is changing society.
Now, one of the changes you'd like to see is for the government to change the law to make it a crime to share explicit images online unless you were intending to distress someone.
Yeah.
Now, we know the government is looking at doing that. We've asked them about it. They've said it's a proposal. But why does that specific thing matter to you so much?
So the revenge porn law started in 2015, and I think if you look at it, the statistics show that it's very, very flawed. So around 6% of victims actually manage to get their perpetrator charged.
Just 6%?
That's 6%, and that's not even into a courtroom yet, so that could get thrown out before court. In the law, it says that you have to prove that the perpetrator intended to cause distress. However, I think if you are sharing explicit images or videos without consent, it's very obvious it will cause distress. And I think this loophole within the law is what's losing so many people a guilty verdict. And if they were to change it and take that out, I think a lot more victims would have a chance of getting some justice like I did.
OK, well, we'll keep a close eye on what the government decides to do on that law, as we've talked a lot about the online safety bill, which is this huge bit of legislation that's going through Parliament at the moment. But just finally, I want to ask you, you know, you were a reality star, you were someone who was doing TV, presenting, and then by a terrible experience has really seems to have turned you into a campaigner and an activist, and clearly a very effective one. I mean, I wonder what's next for you. You know, we talk to politicians every week, and they're not always that direct, they're not always that clear at getting their message across, but you certainly are. What's next? Fancy a bit of politics?
I think at this stage I do. It's definitely not something I anticipated happening in my career, but I've been really enjoying making a difference, so yeah.
Prime Minister?
I mean, we won't push it.
OK, well, Georgia Harrison, thank you so much for coming in. It's been great to hear your story. And if you want to hear more about Georgia, you can watch her documentary on ITV2 tomorrow night at 10. As always, we love to hear from you about your experiences. Is that something that has affected you, or are you concerned about it as a parent or a grandparent, or just try to understand what's going on in the wild west of online? You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, of course, you can use the hashtag. Well, we've got a great panel with us today, all of whom in one way or another understand what's going on in tech. Justine, firstly to you, what do you make of hearing Georgia's story? I mean, you've made a successful big career out of online conversation, but it's pretty terrifying hearing about that.
It is. First of all, I just want to say amazing that Georgia has done what she's done, because that's what it takes, really, a few brave individuals to stand up and really take on board the shame of this whole thing, the public shame, and say, I'm not going to have it, and push back. But I would say parents are really worried about this. Loads of conversations on Mumsnet, not just about girls falling victim to this sort of thing, but boys being drawn into this online misogynistic culture and how they can counter that. And it's one of the things that our generation we have no experience of this. We can't draw on our own past and say, oh yeah, I know how serious this is or how to deal with this. We're guinea pigs here.
So, Ollie, you're at the other end of this, with a news site that's targeted primarily at young men, but this sort of real disconnect between the generations, and perhaps I think Justine's referring to a real kind of lack of understanding, whether it's parents or politicians actually, about how to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's insane that the people at the frontier of this stuff are generally sort of 15, 16, 17-year-olds. That's who, as a society, we're trusting to navigate these incredibly complex, difficult, dangerous issues. And, to be clear, social media and digital media and phones, it can be the gateway to friendship. It can be the gateway to consensual sex. It can be the gateway to going out, socialising, gigs, all of that brilliant stuff. It can also provide you with access to extremist politics, to, dangerous, the revenge porn, all of those kind of dark parts of the web. They exist out there as well. The people who understand it best are the people that have grown up with it. It is that younger generation. And frankly, the fact that I think our discourse politically, nationally, is just so far off the pace compared to what's happening there.
So then, Brent, what is the answer to this? I know a while ago you were, led Prince William, as he was then's task force on cyberbullying, trying to say to companies, look, you've got to get yourselves together or else you're going to be regulated, but it hasn't really worked. If anything, things have become wilder and wilder.
No, I think examples like what George has done are brilliant for the pace of regulation, because what's happened is clearly, you're right, that cyberbullying task force was 5 years ago, and we talked about that it was necessary. It was going to be necessary. If the industry would not self-regulate, then government would need to do it. That was 5 years ago, and now, as you say, it is making its slow way through Parliament. I think what George is doing is so important because it's got to up the pace of regulation.
But is that regulation going to make a blind bit of difference? We see what's happening with new AI sites, ChatGPT. This is changing so fast.
Yeah, I think criminal does make a difference. When you make things criminal, when people get behind bars, when you have real examples of that, it makes people think twice.
Well, what about young men's role in this, though? Because we've talked a little bit about Andrew Tate. Now, often, unwittingly, but we do see young men being drawn into things. But how do you make sure that young men are aware of the kinds of damage, the kind of distress and hurt that they might cause?
Yeah, There's a broader context to Andrew Tate, and the first thing is Andrew Tate did not invent misogyny. Misogyny exists in our society, it is pervasive, and it enables people like him to sound off and sort of activate those sentiments within people. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Secondly, he has his message sort of, it starts off, it hooks you in with men should look after themselves, men should look after the people, and you go, oh, that sounds fairly reasonable, looking after other people, and then it spirals and it gets more extreme, more dangerous and more hateful. There is a route to helping those young men that starts in the same place, that starts with have you considered how you're looking after and helping other people? And then instead of spiralling into a hateful message, you start talking about positive male role models. A great example, the BBC's covered this story extensively, Kevin Sinfield, what he's doing with Rob Burrow, an incredibly tough, hard man, much in the same way as Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate used to be a kickboxer, Kevin Sinfield, rugby league player.
And he's helping to campaign and raise money for motor.
But he also talks about how much he loves Rob Burrow, his friend. It's an open expression of masculine love, which is something that doesn't actually exist very often in our society and culture. So I think it's important to distinguish that if you co-opt the means by which he's communicating with young men, but you display a positive message, it's possible to speak to them and help them in a way that, that doesn't send them down a rabbit hole of hate and fear.
And one of the apps that is, part of the whole landscape, as we were talking about with Oliver Dowden, is TikTok, right? So TikTok, is it something that is dangerous? Should it be banned? We don't sort of ban things in this country, but Justine, what do you think?
I don't think it should be banned, but I think it is potentially dangerous. Hence what the government are doing with civil servants. But I would say, Google knows everything about us. And the power and knowledge in these tech companies is beyond what anyone can dream of.
I think that's a really important point. It's not just TikTok. Facebook knows every single thing about you. The data it collects about you. TikTok is not the first social media company to do this. We live in a world now where the invasion of our privacy by these companies is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, the point is, the customers have been very happy to make the trade about data, but the point about TikTok is it is Chinese owned, and actually the point that the minister didn't make, but I think is very valid, is influence. It can change the way we think about things. It's information and misinformation. There's lots of talk about in Russia that TikTok is only putting pro-war content out in Russia because of the China-Russia link. That shows what can happen. So that's the real threat. So they are being pushed in the US to split the business up, to have it, to throw away their Chinese shareholders, and also to have the data owned on US soil so the Chinese can't access it.
And in your view, should that happen, is that the right thing? So, you know, Western or liberal democracies can keep hold of this stuff.
I think the data, I mean, it seems like TikTok is saying yes. TikTok in the US are saying yes, we will have the data owned by Oracle on US shore and split that data asset. It'll be very important. It'll be very expensive for us, but we're going to do it.
And do you think that should happen in the UK here too?
Yeah, absolutely.
You do? That's very interesting. Well, let's talk about something else that is bound to make some headlines this week. We talked about it a bit with the Minister. A return of sorts for Boris Johnson, who will be up in front of MPs this week. Ollie, what do you think that is going to actually mean for the Conservative Party? I mean, is it just about, you know, this court jester coming back and getting told off, or is it something more serious than that?
I don't think it's more serious than that. I mean, it's going to be great political theatre. I'm sure there'll be one.
Got your popcorn ready?
Yeah, I will be watching for the whole 4 hours, and there'll be plenty of clips of it on Politics Joe as well for people to digest. But I should say, let's not kid ourselves about why Boris Johnson had to resign. Boris Johnson had to resign because he appointed Chris Pincher into government, prompting basically his entire government to resign. His entire government. It's not some kind of stitch-up conspiracy with Sue Gray and Keir Starmer talking about Partygate. His government collapsed. And this myth that he's kind of been, you know, knifed by the establishment, or that there's machinations in Whitehall to dispose, it's nonsense, right?
Do Mumsnetters buy it?
Well, what Mumsnetters can't get past, and I know this because when I interviewed him just before he resigned, and the volume of questions about trust, is that, you know, forget whether Sue Gray knew Keir Starmer or talking to, he basically broke the rules multiple times while the rest of us didn't. And that is unforgivable.
And that still sticks with
And actually
your...
what really annoys me is you watch Oliver Dowden, whenever anyone talks about him, they start smiling as if it's some great big joke, and that is the thing. That...
He didn't really back him though, did he, interestingly?
Well, he was very careful in his words. I mean, Brent, I know you backed Rishi Sunak in the summer, and I think you used to have some links with
adults, which is great. And I think somebody who, as a parent, you can be proud of that is Prime Minister of the country. And I think that's it. I do a lot of talking at schools. And yesterday somebody was asking me, how do we not, or what do I need to do and whatever. And you don't want role models who get away with bluffing like that all the time running the country.
OK, well, we'll see what happens on Wednesday. It is bound to be a good bit of political theatre. And maybe, depending what happens, we'll be talking about it here in the studio next Sunday too. Now, responding to a budget with all their bells and whistles is never easy for opposition parties. So let's hear what Labour has to say about it with Lisa Nandy, who's the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, and she joins us from Salford. Lisa, good morning.
Good morning.
Now Labour is opposing abolishing the tax-free limit for pension savings during a lifetime, but happy for doctors to have special treatment. Are police officers, senior teachers, firemen, well-paid air traffic controllers, are they not worthy of the same kind of treatment?
Well, look, there's a particular problem with doctors, which has been well recognised for some time. We've recognised it, the Chancellor recognised it when he was the chair of the Cross-Party Health Select Committee, and there is a cross-party consensus that you need to do something about that, because if you don't do something about that, then the whole NHS suffered. The story from this government over the course of the last week has shifted from this being a problem about doctors to now this being a wider problem that they can't even quantify. I just listened to Oliver Dowden on your programme being asked how many public sector workers he thinks are in this situation, and he didn't have a clue how to begin answering it. We accept that there is a problem with doctors, but there are fairer and better ways to deal with that problem than simply handing over £1 billion of taxpayers' money to fund a tax cut for the wealthiest 1%, 84% of whom aren't doctors. This isn't just a sledgehammer to crack a nut, it's the most expensive sledgehammer you could have imagined. And imagine how that feels to a paramedic or a station cleaner waking up on Wednesday morning to find out that that, of all things, is the government's priority at a time when they desperately need money back in their pockets.
Except, Lisa, there are plenty of other professions where there are also significant shortages. And are you comfortable with the tax system sort of becoming about what's a worthy career or not? I mean, do we really want our tax system to be some sort of moral arbiter that if you do a particular kind of job, you get to keep more of your own cash?
We think that the government would be far better off looking at the problems that are created by the benefit system, which don't provide a glide path back to work for people who would like to work but are currently classed as too ill to work.
But that's not my question here, that you're saying that basically doctors should be entitled to getting this tax treatment that is favourable comparing to other professions. Are you comfortable with the tax system basically becoming a moral judge, saying if you're worthy because of your job, you get to keep more of your own cash? That's quite a precedent, isn't it?
We're not arguing that this is a moral judgment about who's worthy and who's not. This is a pragmatic response to what is a very real problem at the moment. But as you rightly say, Laura, it's only a sticking plaster response. It's one of the reasons why we vote against this measure. But how would you decide which professions then would be entitled to this kind of tax break? So if you are watching this and you're a head teacher and you think, I quite fancy that, would I get to keep more of my money when I'm if Labour wins the next election, or if you're a chief constable of a police force? How do you make those decisions? Well, most teachers, most police officers, most people in this country are never going to put more than £1 million into their pension pot in the first place. So this isn't a question of opening this up to lots and lots of people. The vast majority of people in this country couldn't even dream of saving this amount of money, and we say it's the wrong priority at the wrong time. But the point I'm trying to make to you is that there are far better ways of dealing with labour shortages which are holding this country back at the moment than just simply focusing on the tax system. The government should have brought forward a proper plan to devolve employment, training and support to local areas so that we can have a far more flexible system that provides that glide path back into work. And just to give you an example of how much this matters, there are twice as many people affected by that in the northeast of England as there are in the southeast of England. This isn't just holding the country back, it's putting a nonsense to the very idea of levelling up that this government is still talking about.
And I'm going to ask you about your plans for more control for local councils in just a second, but there's another important question about the budget. The government also says it's going to freeze the thresholds, the level at which people start paying tax. Now, effectively, that means lots more people either get dragged into a higher tax rate or to pay income tax at all. Would Labour change that policy if you win the next election, or would you keep that freeze?
Well, look, fiscal drag is a real problem. We recognise it, you've recognised it, a lot of people have recognised it, and we want to see working people pay less tax.
So would you get rid of it? Would you change it if you win the election?
But we've seen what happens when governments make unfunded commitments. We saw what happened with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. They crashed the economy and they left working people pay the price. That's why we say that the answer to this problem is to get the economy growing again. That's why our top mission for government, and people will see this in the first 5 years of a Labour government, is that we're going to go for the highest sustained growth in the G7,
but people
driven
also
by
want
people
to
in every
know
part of Britain.
Whether or not they would have their tax bill changed. So is it the case that you just won't answer, or that Labour hasn't decided yet what you do about those tax thresholds? It's a straightforward question.
No, it's a case of not being willing to make commitments that we can't deliver and we can't pay for. We've had 13 years of low or no growth. The UK is now the only country in the G7 that is seeing a fall in our living standards, is seeing us lagging behind other countries, is seeing us at the bottom of the table when it comes to growth and to returning to pre-pandemic levels. We've got to get our economy growing again, otherwise we can't do any of the things that we want to do, and that's why we've said it's going to be a priority. Otherwise what you get is more and more taxes being levied on working people, and we think that is not just wrong, but it's completely unsustainable.
Now, one of the ways you want to do that is by giving more power to local councils and to communities around the country. If people in perhaps your town, Wigan, didn't want a solar farm or a new housing estate on the outskirts of the town, would they have the power under a Labour government to say no?
I was literally in Lee, next door to Wigan, on Friday, where people were asking me why it's so difficult to build clean energy projects in our own communities. The truth is, people around this country, they need homes in their communities, they need jobs and investment back into their communities, but at the moment the planning and the investment systems that we have prevent that from happening. People will accept more housing, they'll accept clean energy schemes. What they won't accept is multi-million-pound houses being built in communities where average household incomes are around £20,000 a year. That's why we say that you've got to devolve power to local communities to put people back in charge of their own destiny. Because my experience is that in the last 13 years, if people had been in charge, they would have made much better.
But would they have the power to say no to things? So part of Labour's plans are very ambitious, you say, to have more green jobs, more power generation, more housing, more of many things that you believe people want and need. But if communities do not want things, would you give them the power to say no?
Well, look, they've already got the power to say no under the current planning rules that we have. What they haven't got is the power to say yes. Since 2015, when the government introduced new rules on onshore wind, we've effectively had a ban on onshore wind, even when communities are clamouring for it. It's easier to build sewers or car parks or roads than it is to build clean energy projects. That's just a nonsense. If you really are serious about empowering communities, you have to give them the power to say yes as well as to say no. And we think this country could do far, far better if, instead of devolution deals for just 9% of us that the government announced this week, if we actually included the other 90%, allowed them to be unshackled from 13 years of Tory failure and start to get investment back into our communities again.
OK, I think you probably heard us speaking to Georgia Harrison this morning, the reality TV star turned campaigner. We've been talking about how the internet, you know, for a generation in a way is a bit like the Wild West. How would Labour specifically help that generation deal with what's going on?
Well, look, first of all, credit to you for having her on the programme. She's brave and she's brilliant, and it's a voice that we haven't heard enough and a debate that we haven't had enough. The Victims Commissioner says that this is the crime that has the most impact on victims, and I think you could hear that from what she was saying. We think that the tech companies, there has to be legislation to force them to act much more quickly when this sort of thing goes online, and we've been pushing for that in Parliament. We think we need to speed up access to justice for victims, and I think Georgia's case shows exactly why. And I was really interested in what she was saying about the loopholes in the law that make it much, much harder to get a conviction. We need to send a very strong message, not just to young women that we support them, but to the next generation that this sort of behaviour is not going to be tolerated. I think she's way ahead of politicians on this, actually, and we're determined as the Labour Party that we'll support her in making sure that the political system catches up.
Lisa, Nandy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And as we were discussing, we'll certainly keep a close eye on what happens on that huge piece of law going through Parliament about to try and help the risk to people online. Now, it's only a month since Nicola Sturgeon quit as Scotland's First Minister, but a lot has changed for her party. In recent days, the SNP winning machine has looked a bit more like a rabble. There have been scraps between the contenders trying to replace her, and yesterday the party's chief executive, who just happens to be Miss Sturgeon's husband, quit after the party failed to come clean over a simple question of how many members it has. In the last couple of weeks, we've spoken to Ash Regan and Hamza Yousaf, who are both after the job. But yesterday, it was Kate Forbes' turn. Now, she's faced tricky questions of her own due to her conservative Christian beliefs. But we spoke to her yesterday, just an hour or so after the party chief executive's dramatic exit.
I think at the heart of this is about the fact that the decisions within the SNP have been taken by too few people. And I think that's well recognised across the political domain. And SNP members want to know that our institution is democratic, that they can influence it, that they can shape policy. I think there's been a feeling that they are disempowered from that process.
With the departure of the chief executive, though, are you now confident that this contest is being run fairly, or would you still like there to be an independent auditor looking at how it's being run?
So I have full confidence and trust in the process. The point I made around an independent auditor was to try and give as much trust and confidence to those that were voting. It's fairly standard common practice when it comes to election contests for there to be that third-party independent auditing. And I would hope that we can get to the end of this contest knowing that the decisions that SNP members are taking when they vote is the decision that they truly want when it comes to leadership of the party.
You've been pitching yourself as the change candidate, as you've explained, but how can you be a change candidate when you've held one of the most senior jobs in the Scottish Government for some time? I mean, you were Scotland's chancellor with the powers that the Finance Secretary in Scotland has. How can you be the change candidate when you've been part of the government?
In a contest, we have the opportunity to talk about what's been going well in the party. And let's make no mistake, the SNP has been winning elections because of many of the things that it has done well, and I'm proud of that track record. But we are in the teeth of a cost of living crisis. Our NHS needs reform. Businesses have weathered storm after storm with Brexit, COVID, cost of living. We fundamentally need to talk about how to lead the party into the next decade.
But what is it that you think has gone wrong? If you want to do things differently, we've heard that loud and clear. What has gone wrong then?
3 things. 1, the ability to listen, to understand the priorities of the people that we are here to serve. Secondly, the ability to deliver. So when we have solid, good policies, we need to make them happen. I'm speaking to you from one end of the A9, for example, Scotland's backbone. We said we'd dual it, we haven't done it. We need to be able to deliver. And the third thing is, the raison d'etre for the SNP is, of course, independence. And I think that we've lost some of the respectful dialogue that we need when it comes to persuading those who are not yet persuaded of the case that we have to make on independence. We need to cut the abuse and the vitriol and actually respect the reasons why people might not be persuaded and work hard to persuade them. There's 3 things that I think need to be done differently.
That's quite some list though, Kate Forbes. I mean, that's quite damning about what's been going on. I mean, you've just said the SNP has lost its ability to listen to the public. It's lost its ability actually to get things done despite making political promises. What do you think your colleagues will think of you being quite so critical of a government you've been part of, let alone the public?
You cannot deliver change unless you have trust. To have trust, you need to have candour about the challenges that we face. And right now, we are at a crossroads. There's no question about that. We have come through 16 years of successful government. If we are going to see the SNP continue to win elections, continue to take on the opposition, not least the Labour Party at the next election, that we need to get serious about what's worked and what's not worked. And I think you can build on the solid track record that we have whilst being conscious of what else needs to change. And, you know, if continuity was good enough, then there's a candidate here who offers continuity.
And you're referring there to Hamza Youssef, who at the moment a majority of MSPs have said they back. I mean, on a practical point, if you cannot persuade most of your MSP colleagues at Holyrood to back you, how do you think you could put a government together, let alone convince the public you're the right person to take this on?
Well, first of all, when it comes to the public, poll after poll shows that I am more trusted on every policy area than either of my fellow candidates. But every SNP member has 1 vote. That includes elected representatives. And it's incumbent on all of us to respect the outcome of the election that's determined by SNP members. I have absolute confidence in being able to pull together a government of some of the most talented people in the SNP. Of that, I have no doubt.
As Economic Secretary, it was your responsibility to get the Scottish economy going. Yet by some measures, the Scottish economy is forecast to grow more slowly than the rest of the UK. And even if you put a positive gloss on it, it's not exactly looking great. So why would that track record persuade anyone that you're the person with a good plan?
Well, because I've outlined that plan, and the plan is to focus on investing in infrastructure, to look at the regulatory burden on businesses, and to ensure that we have a competitive regime when it comes to taxation.
And for people who want to prosper, what can you say to them about their tax bills in Scotland? So you have the power to increase income tax, and as things stand, it is higher in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. Do you back the income tax rises that were brought in while you were recently on maternity leave? Or would you rule out further income tax rises?
I'd certainly rule out further income tax rises. But the point I'd make about the recent hike is, of course, the higher tax is a symptom of the fact that our economy is growing so slowly and our tax base is not broad enough. We need to raise the money for our public services because people rely on that. But I'd far rather we focused on expanding the tax base and growing our economy.
You've been asked a lot during this race about your Christian faith. Do you feel that you have been treated differently as somebody with a strong Christian faith than you might have been if you had a strong faith in a different religion?
I think there has been far more scrutiny of my faith as a result of being a Christian, but I think also as a result of being honest and upfront at the beginning. The approach I took was that voters deserve to know who they're voting for. And I took the approach that honesty and candour is better than anything else. So I think that has resulted in greater scrutiny than might otherwise be the case.
So do you think you've been punished then for saying what you believe?
Well, I think there has been quite a stunning level of scrutiny and perhaps backlash from some quarters. Of course, I won't be the only person with faith in high office. We have a Muslim mayor of London, we have a Hindu in number 10, and I think people of faith have the right to occupy high office.
And you say you would govern without prejudice, but there has been concern, particularly among the gay community, about some of your deeply held views. If you were a member of that community and watching today and thinking, you know what, I like the sound of Kate Forbes, I like some of the things that she said in a campaign, but I can't bring myself to vote for someone who believes that my relationship, the way I live my life, is wrong. What would you say to them today?
I would say that I give you an honest pledge today to govern in a way that delivers for you, that does not in any way undermine your rights and actually seeks to enhance your opportunities in Scotland to ensure that Scotland is truly that tolerant and pluralistic nation that we all want to see.
And just on a different issue, you know, you've talked there about the level of scrutiny you've already had to endure during this campaign. Nicola Sturgeon said when she was stepping down that it had become almost impossible even to go and meet friends for a coffee. You, like one of the other candidates, have got a young family. Do you think that you would approach the level of intrusion, the lack of privacy, all that scrutiny? How do you think you'd deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that I have had to weigh up as I've approached this contest. It might have been easier not to stand, but the reason I chose to stand is because I believe that we are at a crossroads. And I've got a 7-month-old baby that thankfully you can't hear and screaming in the background. But I've had to juggle a very young family with the contest. But many mothers do that. Many mothers and fathers have to do that. And I would certainly look for a slightly more sustainable model when it comes to childcare if I get the role. But what better when it comes to delivering, say, for mothers and parents in Scotland than to have a young mother in the role of being First Minister. And I certainly think that role should be open to anyone, irrespective of their personal circumstances.
OK, Kate Forbes, well, we're grateful for your time. There's only a few days left to go in the campaign, so thank you very much for speaking to us this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's right. There's only 8 days, I think, Ollie, till the next new Scottish First Minister is announced. You've been following this race, but goodness me, the SNP has been in a right old mess.
Yeah, meltdown. I mean, particularly for someone who's not an informed observer of Scottish politics, you know, in the space of a few months, the First Minister, the Chief Executive, you look at the SNP, it would appear to be in complete meltdown, whoever wins this election. And I think that's actually an open question, by the way, as much as people want Humza to win. What happens next? They're going to have a right old mess to sort out.
So you're referring there to Humza Yousaf, who's seen as a sort of party establishment candidate. But Justine, what do you think Mumsnetters think actually about the exit of Nicola Sturgeon from the scene? I mean, she's been such a dominant force in politics, one of the politicians of her generation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, it's been great to have a woman at the top. I mean, there are some people on Mumsnet who certainly don't share her beliefs or her policy about self-ID, but generally speaking, I think she's been a great advert for womanhood. What I would say is any business leader has to have a succession plan, and she seems to have completely failed on that, because look at the chaos we've got now.
Interesting. And Ollie, a prediction on who might win it? I know you said it's an open question, but I'm going to ask you to put your colours to the mast.
Humza's edging it, I think.
Okay.
I think. But political prediction is a mug's game.
Well, it is. Well, let's ask a different question. We started the programme asking whether or not the Tories actually seem to be getting on track. Brent, I know you follow Conservative politics, but you also run big businesses. Do you think they are starting to get themselves together after months of chaos?
Yeah, look, I think the reaction to the budget was actually pretty good. And actually, I think today what was highlighted was this pension stuff, which actually has become more popular, and Labour are going to have to backtrack. In the polling on it, it's actually popular across the country. This is an aspirational country. And the Conservatives are positioning themselves as a party of growth and aspiration, and I'm hoping that Labour can be more on aspiration.
Are they backtracking on it at all? I think Wes Streeting backed it a couple of months ago, didn't he?
Well, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, said it would be OK for doctors, but not for everybody else. But it's an interesting question, and that may be the top line, as we might say, of the budget debate in the next few days. But Jo, finally to you, Wally, what do you think about the Tories getting back on track? Do your people who come to your site, the under-30s, think that?
No. They don't. It's a really interesting question, what's going to happen with younger voters, right? Galvanised in 2019 by Corbyn, progressive politics, there's now a convergence. I think we're returning to consensus politics. You look at the gaps between Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, a lot of that policy in the budget, that's lifted from Labour. It's half-baked in terms of childcare. They've got a more substantial offer the Conservatives have. But the parties are aligning closely together now, and I don't know whether young people are going to be particularly galvanised by that as they were in the past. Well,
very live conversation to have in this studio in the weeks and months ahead, but we're out of time for today. Thank you, all three of you, for coming in. It's been great to have you, and of course, great to have you with us this morning as well after a busy political week, when after all the Prime Minister's frantic activity, there is a calmer mood around the place. But Rishi Sunak's allies can't take that for granted, not just because Boris Johnson is in front of MPs this week taking questions on what really happened under his roof during lockdown, but also there's a vote this week on the deal that the government brokered with the EU on Northern Ireland. And if either of those go badly, well, we'll have plenty to talk about in the studio next week. Remember, you can always get in touch or catch up on the iPlayer. I look forward to seeing you here back next week. Goodbye for now.